I'd like to start by thanking Debbie Bates and her crew for making D-Day Conneaut 2020 a virtual reality. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, we had to cancel the actual event. But last year, Whiskey 7 was the D-Day guest of honor. We participated in the airborne part of the reenactments on the beach, and then gave about 3 days, well, we gave 3 days of rides out of Ashtabula, Ohio. It was really an honor to be there. Whiskey 7 is a veteran of the D-Day invasion, which marked the beginning of the end of World War II. My name is Chris Polhemus. I'm the chief pilot on Whiskey 7 for the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo, New York. About 9 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps developed the Air Transport Command, the thought being we needed to move troops and supplies around the world with the way the situation was. They decided on the DC-3 as the basic platform for the military transport. A fellow named Bob Uhrig was one of the engineering officers that was tasked with and made the initial conversions. And basically the difference between a civilian DC-3 and the military C47 is a large cargo door on the rear left side of the fuselage and a beefed up or strengthened floor that was able to support the weight of all the equipment that needed to be carried. There's a book written based on the wartime diary of Bob Uhrig. It's called Invasion Stripes, and this is one of the books that we use as a textbook when we're studying the history of the airplane that we have at the museum. It was early 1943 when Whiskey 7 joined the war in Europe, and the first operation that it was involved with was Operation Torch, and that was the Allied invasion of North Africa, where the Germans had already gotten a stronghold. We needed to ferry a lot of airplanes to Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and the way they did that is they used the southern route initially. So when the C-47, actually the DC-3, came out of the factory in Long Beach, California, it was ferried to Wichita, Kansas, where the military conversion took place. And then it went down to Miami, Florida. The ferry route from Miami was down to Puerto Rico, Trinidad, along the east coast of South America, to Belém, Brazil, where the Amazon River runs out into the Atlantic Ocean, and finally to Natal, Brazil, which was the closest, shortest point across the South Atlantic. Unfortunately, the DC-3 carries only 800 gallons of fuel. It burns 100 gallons an hour, and that gives you about 140 knots true airspeed. So with 8 hours of endurance, they could just barely make it halfway across the South Atlantic, which was where Ascension Island is located. And now Ascension Island is nothing more than a speck in the ocean, a speck of land out in the ocean. It's a mile wide and 2 miles long. But the Army Air Corps developed that as basically a runway and a refueling depot. So leaving Natal, the navigation had to be absolutely spot on to hit Ascension Island. Well, the Germans saw what was going on, and they parked submarines to the north and south of Ascension Island, and they had transmitters on board. And when they detected a flight of Allied aircraft coming across the Atlantic there, they would send the submarines north and south of the island, putting out these false navigation signals. And we lost quite a few airplanes following the German U-boat signal, where they just basically ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. There's a lot of stories involved with every operation here, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, but it's a shame not to share as much of this information as I can with you guys. So that was Operation Torch. Basically, what the mission was to deliver priority cargo to the front lines. By that I mean gas, oil, bombs, ammunition, food, and particular water. And it also, the other half of the mission was the prompt evacuation of wounded military back behind the lines to medical facilities, and that led to the saving of many American lives. So the C-47 was very valuable in North Italy. The next thing that it did was in July of 1943, it kicked off Operation Husky. And Operation Husky was where the C47s from North Africa would navigate out towards the island of Malta and then head to Sicily. And in Sicily, that's where they were dropping the paratroopers and releasing the gliders, the troop transport gliders in tow for the invasion, to set up for the invasion of Italy. On the very first run across the Mediterranean, they, just before getting to the coast of Sicily, they overflew a fleet of American destroyers. Well, the destroyers had just literally minutes before been attacked by German bombers. They were being strafed and bombed. So when the C-47s came overhead, they were misidentified as German airplanes, and through friendly fire, we lost a pretty large number of aircraft and airmen to the shoot downs of our own airplanes. August and November, Operation Giant. Some airfields were established on the mainland of Italy, and they operated all through the winter right there, basically just outside of Rome. That's where we developed the Pathfinder operation, where paratroopers would jump into the designated drop zones, the DZs, with transmitters, radio transmitters, and Rebecca antennas were installed on either side of the cockpits, the outside of the cockpit there on the fuselage, in order to home in on these navigation signals. And that way we got really good pinpoint accuracy over the drop zones for future operations. February of 1944, Whiskey 7 left Rome and it flew to Gibraltar. The guys called it the Rock. Spent a couple of days there, and then from Gibraltar they went on to the United Kingdom. They crossed the southwest coast of England right at a place called Land's End, and there was a refueling station in Cornwall that was set up for the Allied aircraft coming up from there. From there they went up to RAF Cottesmore, which is in the East Midlands, just up to the north of London and Cambridge. And that's the base that Whiskey 7 operated at for quite a bit of its time in Europe. At Cottesmore, what they did was they trained, and they trained. They trained in everything. They trained in parachute drops, they trained in glider tows, they trained in day and night formation flying, radio and radar procedures. And this is where I'd like to bring up another really important book, and a very, very good friend of the museum. Mike Ingressano wrote this book about the troop carrier squadrons, Valor Without Arms. So Mike served in the war with the 316th Troop Carrier Group as a radio operator, and he intimately knew our airplane Whiskey 7. All of his aircraft that he flew on had the designation of Whiskey 7. Mike was a member of the museum, and he gave us a lot of really good information, a lot of stories. One thing he said about arriving in Cottesmore, he said it was paradise. They thought they had died and gone to heaven. They had just spent months in the sand and the fleas in the deserts of North Africa, in the mud and the trenches of an Italian winter. And he says, we got to the UK and we had hot water, we had good food, we had beer, and we had pretty girls. These guys really enjoyed their time there in the UK. On the 5th of June was when Whiskey 7 got her war paint put on. Basically the invasion stripes and the chalk marks. The invasion stripes were to prevent a misidentification, such as what happened in Italy going into Sicily there with friendly aircraft. So all the Allied aircraft participating in the D-Day invasion had the real traditional invasion stripes put on there. The chalk marks were put on at the last minute so that the paratroopers would know which airplane to go to and to get on for the mission on this D-Day invasion. So the 5th of June was the night before the actual amphibious assault, which occurred early in the morning on the 6th of June. And their mission was to drop behind the enemy lines and cut off the supply lines to the Germans on the coast. So Whiskey 7 was the lead aircraft in the second serial across the English Channel on the night before D-Day. Lieutenant Leonard Lieutenant Commander Leonard Fletcher was the pilot on board. Leonard Fletcher was also Mike Ingressano's commanding officer. Mike Ingressano was the radio operator in the number 2 ship right off of the wing of Whiskey 7 on that nighttime invasion. There's a lot of coincidences here, but it's really cool to have gotten a lot of these stories first person from somebody who had been there in that very same airplane. They took off with 17 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Battalion, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 17 paratroopers at 11 o'clock at night, and at 2:15 in the morning, they were right overhead the Lafier Bridge drop zone. That was just on the outskirts of the town St. Mary Glace, which was the first town to be liberated by the Allies in World War II. There was a movie done, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It's called The Longest Day, and it portrays that event really well. In September of '44, Whiskey 7 was involved in Market Garden, and that was up over Holland as we started getting closer and closer to Germany. It was described as an airborne carpet along the road to Arnhem, which was right in the very eastern part of Holland on the German border. Basically, Whiskey 7 at that point was towing troop transport gliders with 101st Airborne troops on board. And then in 1945, as the war was winding down, Operation Varsity was the final operation it was involved in, and that's when we basically were driving across the Rhine River and right into Germany. So every major operation in World War II was participated in with these aircraft of the Troop Carrier Squadrons. The airplane was donated to the museum in 2006, and we decided that after a bunch of years of operating the airplane, we'd like to fly it back to Europe for an anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Well, we decided to make it 2014. So our return to Normandy was to celebrate and recognize the 70th anniversary of D-Day. It took 2 years of planning to do this. As chief pilot, I spent an awful lot of time working out exactly what the route was going to be and all the logistics for the flight. My day job is flying a 767 back and forth to Europe, so I was pretty familiar with the North Atlantic and the European theater. It was US Air at the time, and I went over to the operations department, had the manager sit down with some of the senior guys, and we got full support from US Air, from the airline, with help with flight planning, flight following, weather information, communications. It really helped out tremendously. There was a book written by a fellow named Ernest Gann called Fate is the Hunter, and an excellent book. He was a basically air transport command pilot that was helping to devise and develop all of the routes to get the airplanes to Europe. And Fate is the Hunter was so well written, I decided, why reinvent the wheel? He described exactly the blue spruce routes that they used. So we did the same thing. We took off from Geneseo and flew to Presque Isle, Maine, which was where the Air Transport Command headquarters were. There was a big army hospital there for the evacuees at the time. And we spent the night in Presque Isle, had a real nice welcoming party. The mayor was there, he gave us the keys to the city. The next morning we took off, we flew to Goose Bay, Labrador. From Goose Bay, we went over to Narsarsuaq, Greenland. It was called Bluey West 1, and it still is called Bluey West 1 today. Another quick story about Narsarsuaq. Again, only 800 gallons of fuel on a C47, 8 hours of endurance from Goose Bay, Labrador to Iceland was much too long of a leg, so they needed to find a stop, a refueling stop, in the southern part of Greenland. So a Navy ship was sent to Greenland with a hold full of PSP, perforated steel planking, CBs, engineers, construction equipment, and they spent about 2 weeks going in and out of every fjord and bay in the southern part of Greenland until they went 50 miles up Eriks Fjord, and they found a flat, fertile, glacial runoff plain, enough room to get about a 5,000-foot runway in, So they unloaded the L-birds from the airplane. They did a little scouting all the way around, and they saw there was no other pieces of flat land in all of the southern half of Greenland. It was the only place available. Kind of an aside note, back in 800 AD, Eric the Red led his men, the Vikings, from the west coast of Norway westbound until they got to Iceland. They set up a Viking colony. About 2 years later, he killed a guy. He got kicked out of the Viking colony in Iceland, so he and his guys got in the longboats and they continued further westbound to the southern tip of Greenland. And they spent 4 months, the entire summer, in and out of every bay and every fjord in the southern part of Greenland until they went 50 miles up this one fjord and they found a real fertile, flat, glacial plain. It was a perfect place for their sheep and their goats, and that's where he established the Viking colony in Narsarsuaq. That's where his son, Leif, Eric's son, was born, and when he came of age, he and his buddies got in a longboat and they went further west to the northern tip of Newfoundland and founded the first Viking colony in North America. So it was kind of interesting that they're in the same place right there. From Bluey West 1, we flew across the southern part, the ice cap. We had minimum altitudes, depending on the pressure, the daily pressure of 11 or 12,000 feet. So we climbed out VFR and crossed over the southern part of Greenland, went into downtown Reykjavik, Iceland, spent the night there. From there we flew to Prestwick, Scotland, which was exactly the routing that they took back in World War II. We unloaded all our overwater equipment, the survival suits, the rafts, the high frequency radio, and from Prestwick we continued on down to Duxford, England. Duxford is real close to RAF Cottesmore. It's where the big museum is, and we participated in the 70th anniversary air show at Duxford. We were one of 5 C47s out flying together, and it was very nice. We left Duxford on Memorial Day and got to visit the American Cemetery in Cambridge, England on the way out, which we also did some flybys of. From Duxford, we went to Ramstein, Germany, Ramstein Air Force Base. That's the home of the 37th Airlift Command. And about 5 years prior to the trip, the commander of the unit called to the museum up in Geneseo and said, "We've done a lot of research on our history, and you have the very last airworthy C-47 from the original 37th Troop Carrier Squadron. If you're ever in Europe, would you please come and visit?" So we did just that, and what a reunion it was. We spent 4 or 5 days there. We did a lot of flying together with the brand new C-130J models that the 37th was operating. An awful lot of parties. We recreated a picture that was taken of Whiskey 7 in 1944. We did it present day right there, where everybody in the squadron went out and were on the leading edge of the wings, the engine nacelles along the top of the fuselage. So that, with the original picture, is hanging in their operations today. There was no aviation fuel available in Ramstein. All they had was jet fuel. So we went from Ramstein to Luxembourg. And then in Luxembourg, we were on about a 3-mile final, landing to the northeast. And the controller called to us and asked if we saw the American cemetery just in front of the right wing of the airplane. Well, looking over there, you could see the white crosses in the sunshine and a beautiful American flag flying up overhead the cemetery. I said, "Yes, sir, we do." He says, "That's where your General George Patton is buried." And that was something that I didn't know about. From Luxembourg with full fuel, we went to Cherbourg, France, flew right over top Paris to Cherbourg, and we operated for 10 days in Cherbourg, France, dropping paratroopers at all the original drop zones. It was a really, really nice trip. On the 6th of June at 7 o'clock in the morning, Helen Patton, General Patton's granddaughter, got on board our airplane with the mayor of Picqueville, France, which was the first drop zone in Normandy to be used by Allied paratroopers. So we took the mayor and Helen Patton, and we had 4 parachutists in the back of the airplane. 2 of them were tandem. So the mayor went out first, Helen Patton went out next as tandem jumpers, and then the 2 solo jumpers had both the American and the French flags. And that's how the D-Day ceremony on the Normandy Peninsula was started in 2014. We went back to Cherbourg, we fueled the airplane, and a fella named Les Cruz got on board the airplane with us. Les is the last man alive that was on that airplane during the D-Day invasion. He was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne, 94 years old, lives up to the north of Philadelphia. So we paid for Les's and his family's airline tickets to come and join us. So it was a real special time to have him on that airplane 70 years later to the day, the same man on the same airplane. There were about a half dozen other veterans that were on the plane that morning with us. Tom Brokaw and his video photographer were the last ones to get on our airplane. And we all went back into the cabin, and we just wanted to make sure everyone knew the significance that we were going to be flying right overhead the same drop zone, on the same bearing, at the same altitude and the same speed 70 years later with a guy that was right there. And Les started by saying things were a little different 70 years ago. And he went on to tell us stories. He told us that over half of the guys he boarded that airplane with in RAF Cottesmore the night before were dead before they hit the ground. He says the Germans had us nailed underneath those parachutes. It was like shooting a fish in a barrel. And then he says, and when we did land, he says, the only thing that saved his life was a hedgerow. He was one of the last guys off of the airplane, and he drifted into the hedgerow. He said it took him the rest of the night to put together enough guys to continue with their original mission, which was to take control of a road that was 10 kilometers long from Cherbourg to Montbourg, France. So once they got strength enough to do that, first daylight came, they started marching up north towards Montbourg, and as soon as they got out of the woods, the Germans had them nailed again. They hit them with the artillery. There were shells flying around. All they could do was drop face down in the dirt. He said that the guy right next to him was his best friend. They were both from Brooklyn, New York. They had enlisted together, they had trained together, they came to Europe together, and he heard his buddy just moaning. So he crawled over on his stomach, and he had taken a big piece of shrapnel through his thigh. So Les said, I rolled on my back, pulled my belt off, put it around his leg as a tourniquet, and we got him back into the woods again. We had a medic back there. He says, we continued on with our mission, and we took the road to Montbourg. 3 days later, we got back to St. Mary Glace, and I tried to find my friend, and I found out he didn't make it. He said, just yesterday, I laid a wreath on his grave. He never made it back home. I'm sorry. Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. Basically, the generation that survived the Depression, won the war, and made America the greatest country the world has ever known. Our job is to honor and remember not only the D-Day veterans, but all of those who served and have given us the freedoms and the liberties we enjoy today. Thank you very much, and God bless America.